Grandma left me everything because I was the only one who cared enough to be there, my sister Linda announced at the reception after the funeral, holding her coffee cup with both hands as relatives gathered around her. People nodded. Some even reached out to squeeze her shoulder. They looked at her with admiration, the kind reserved for someone who had supposedly sacrificed years of her life for an aging parent. I stood near the window of the church fellowship hall and listened in silence. My name is Emily Carter. I was 67 years old that spring, and I had just buried my grandmother, Margaret Carter, at the age of 89. The rain tapped softly against the glass, and the scent of fresh flowers lingered in the room. Everyone seemed eager to believe Linda's story. After all, she had been telling the same version for years. According to her, she spent nearly every day caring for Grandma. According to her, she gave up vacations, hobbies, and opportunities so Grandma would never feel alone. According to her, every dollar Grandma left behind had been earned through devotion. But as I watched the faces around me, I felt a strange discomfort settle in my chest. Not anger, not jealousy, something quieter, something colder. A memory surfaced. 6 months earlier, I had called Grandma on a Tuesday evening. She sounded tired. During our conversation, she mentioned eating dinner alone while watching an old game show. At the time, I thought little of it. Yet Linda had later told the family she spent that entire evening at Grandma's house helping her organize medications and prepare meals for the week. Another memory followed. The previous Thanksgiving, Linda had proudly told everyone she canceled holiday plans to stay with Grandma. Yet I distinctly remembered seeing photos online from a resort nearly 300 miles away during that same weekend. Small things, tiny inconsistencies, the kind people dismiss because they seem unimportant. But standing there after the funeral, listening to Linda accept praise she never questioned, those memories began fitting together in a way that made me uneasy. Then something unexpected caught my attention. Near the doorway stood a woman I recognized immediately, Rachel Morris. She had worked as one of Grandma's professional caregivers during the final years of her life. Rachel wasn't part of the family, but she had become a familiar presence whenever I visited. She was kind, organized, and deeply respectful toward Grandma. As Linda continued speaking, Rachel's expression changed. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't roll her eyes or interrupt. Instead, she lowered her gaze and pressed her lips together. For a moment, she looked as though she wanted to say something but thought better of it. Then she quietly turned away. That brief reaction lasted only seconds, but I noticed it. And once I noticed it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would Rachel look uncomfortable if Linda's story were true? Why would someone who had actually been there seem uneasy hearing those claims? Across the room, relatives continued praising my sister. Linda smiled modestly and accepted every compliment. She spoke about sacrifice, about responsibility, about love. Yet Rachel slipped out the side door without saying a word. I watched her leave through the rain-speckled glass. Something told me the story everyone believed was incomplete, maybe even entirely wrong. I didn't know it then, but that quiet moment beside the church window would become the beginning of everything. Because 3 days later, Rachel would call me unexpectedly, and what she was about to reveal would change the way our family viewed Linda forever. 3 days after the funeral, I was standing in my kitchen rinsing a coffee mug when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. The past week had been filled with calls from distant relatives, insurance representatives, and people offering condolences. I was tired of talking. Still, something made me answer. "Emily," a calm voice asked. "This is Rachel Morris." I immediately recognized the name. I glanced through the window above my sink. The morning sky was gray, and a light drizzle had settled over the neighborhood. "Of course," I said. "How are you holding up?" There was a brief pause. "I have been better," Rachel replied. "I cared about your grandmother very much." I leaned against the counter. "She cared about you too." Another silence followed. It felt different this time. Deliberate. Careful. Finally, Rachel spoke again. "There are some things I think you should know." My grip tightened slightly around the phone. The same uneasy feeling from the funeral returned. "What kind of things?" I asked. "Not over the phone," she said gently. "Would you be willing to meet me?" We arranged to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe a few miles from my house. The next day arrived cold and damp. I reached the cafe 10 minutes early and found Rachel already seated near the back. She looked exactly as I remembered, neatly dressed, organized, calm. Yet there was tension in her expression that I had never noticed before. After we ordered coffee, neither of us spoke for a moment. Rachel stirred her drink slowly. I have been trying to decide whether I should say anything, she finally admitted. But after what I heard at the funeral, I do not think staying quiet is the right thing to do. I knew immediately who she meant. Linda. Rachel looked down at the table. Your sister has been telling people that she was your grandmother's primary caregiver. I nodded. That is what everyone believes. Rachel exhaled softly. Emily, that is not what happened. The sounds of the cafe seemed to fade. I remained silent. Rachel continued carefully. I am not saying Linda never visited. She did, but not nearly as often as people think. I remembered the praise Linda had received after the funeral. The admiration. The sympathy. Rachel folded her hands together. Your grandmother spent most of her final years receiving support from professional caregivers. We worked in shifts. We documented everything. Every visit. Every medication. Every appointment. Every concern. My heart began to beat faster. Everything? I asked. Rachel nodded. Everything. I stared at her. Then why did Grandma never say anything? Rachel gave a sad smile. Because she did not like conflict. She always hoped the family would stay close. That sounded exactly like Margaret Carter. Rachel reached into her bag and removed a small notebook. She did not open it. She simply rested her hand on top of it. Your grandmother talked about you often, she said. She worried that people would misunderstand the truth after she was gone. I felt a chill despite the warm cafe. What truth? Rachel met my eyes. That the story being told now is not the story she lived. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Outside, rain tapped against the glass. Cars rolled past on the wet street. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Then Rachel said the words that would stay with me long after that meeting ended. Emily, there are records. Detailed records. And if anyone claims they were there every day, those records can prove whether that is true or not. After leaving the cafe, I drove home with the radio off. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Rachel's words echoed in my head. There are records. Detailed records. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized I was no longer thinking about what Linda had said at the funeral. I was thinking about what Grandma had not said during the last years of her life. That evening, I pulled out an old storage box from the hall closet. It was filled with birthday cards, photographs, handwritten notes, and holiday letters. Many of them had belonged to Grandma. I carried the box to my dining room table and began sorting through its contents. At first, I was only looking for comfort. Familiar handwriting. Familiar memories. But as the hours passed, something else emerged. Patterns. Small details I had ignored before. One photograph showed Grandma smiling on her front porch during a spring afternoon. The date printed on the back caught my attention. According to Linda, she had spent that entire week caring for Grandma around the clock after a medical appointment. Yet I remembered seeing social media photos from the same week showing Linda and several friends at a beach resort nearly 200 miles away. I found another clue inside a Christmas card. Grandma had written a short note thanking me for a grocery delivery I had arranged. At the bottom, she added a simple sentence. The caregivers have been wonderful lately. Not Linda. Not family. The caregivers. I sat back in my chair and stared at the words. It was such a small thing. Yet suddenly it seemed important. Over the next few days, more memories surfaced. I remembered calling Grandma one Sunday afternoon and hearing unfamiliar voices in the background. When I asked who was visiting, she explained that one of her caregivers was helping organize medications and prepare meals for the week. Another time, she mentioned that Rachel had driven her to a specialist appointment because nobody else was available. At the time, I had accepted those comments without much thought. Now I viewed them differently. They did not match the story Linda had spent years telling. The more I thought about it, the more one memory refused to leave me alone. About a year before Grandma passed away, I had invited her to lunch. We sat together in a small restaurant overlooking the river. It was one of those quiet places where conversations felt easier. During dessert, she became unusually thoughtful. She stirred her tea for several seconds before speaking. Families have a way of believing the loudest voice, she said. I smiled and asked what she meant. Grandma simply shook her head and changed the subject. At the time, I assumed she was speaking generally. Now I wondered if she had been trying to tell me something. The following morning, I opened my laptop and began reviewing old family photographs, emails, and messages. I was not looking for evidence. Not yet. I was trying to understand whether my doubts were real or simply the product of grief. But every memory seemed to point in the same direction. Linda's version of events appeared larger than life, while the reality I remembered was quieter and far more complicated. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a new message from Rachel. Attached was a photograph of a calendar page from one of the caregiving logs. Several dates were highlighted. Nothing dramatic. Nothing shocking. Just names, times, and documented visits. Yet one thing stood out immediately. Across an entire month of entries, Linda's name appeared only once. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I realized this was no longer a question of memory. For the first time, I was looking at something that could be verified. And that single page made me wonder what the rest of the records might reveal. The calendar page stayed open on my laptop long after the sun went down. I sat alone in my living room, reading the same entries again and again. The information itself was simple. Dates, arrival times, departure times, notes about medications, meals, appointments, and daily routines. Yet the simplicity made it harder to ignore. There was no room for exaggeration, no emotional storytelling, no dramatic interpretation, just facts. Over the next week, Rachel and I spoke several times. She remained careful with every word. She never insulted Linda. She never tried to convince me of anything. Instead, she answered my questions and explained how professional caregiving records worked. Every visit had to be documented. Every schedule adjustment was recorded. Every caregiver signed reports that became part of an official file. Listening to her, I realized how different this was from family memories. Memories could fade. Records could not. One afternoon, Rachel invited me to review additional documentation at the agency office. The building was small and unremarkable, located in a quiet business park about 15 minutes from my house. I remember feeling nervous as I walked through the front door. Part of me still hoped everything could somehow be explained. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe Linda had contributed more than the records showed. Maybe the truth existed somewhere between the stories. Rachel greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room. A thick folder sat on the table. She opened it carefully. Inside were months of caregiving reports. I began turning pages. At first, I focused on Grandma. Notes about her favorite television programs. Notes about her garden. Notes about her health appointments. The details were strangely comforting because they captured ordinary moments from her final years. Then I started paying attention to visitor logs. Family visits were routinely noted because caregivers needed accurate information about who entered the home. My eyes moved down page after page. Some weeks showed no family visits at all. Other weeks listed brief visits lasting less than an hour. Several entries included my name. A few included cousins. Occasionally, Linda's name appeared, but not often. Certainly not enough to support the story she had told everyone. What struck me most was a pattern that repeated over and over. Whenever Linda visited, the notes were remarkably short. Arrival, conversation, departure. In contrast, the caregivers documented dozens of hours each week spent assisting Grandma with daily needs. The difference was impossible to overlook. I closed the folder and stared at the table. Rachel remained silent, allowing me to process everything. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me for days. Did Grandma know what Linda was telling people? Rachel hesitated. I believe she did. The answer settled heavily between us. Then why did she never correct her? Rachel offered a sad smile. Because your grandmother loved her family. She spent most of her life protecting relationships, even when she was disappointed. That sounded exactly like Grandma. On the drive home, I thought about all the times she had changed the subject whenever family tensions surfaced. All the times she chose peace over confrontation. For years, Linda had benefited from that silence. But now the silence was beginning to break. Later that evening, I received another surprise. An email arrived from Rachel containing a scanned copy of a monthly caregiver summary. Near the bottom was a handwritten note from Grandma herself. The sentence was brief, but it stopped me cold. I am grateful for those who help me, even when nobody sees what they do. I read the line 3 times. Then I noticed the date. It had been written only 4 months before she passed away. For the next several days, I carried a copy of that handwritten note everywhere. It remained folded inside my purse, tucked between receipts and appointment cards. Every time I read it, I heard Grandma's voice. Not because the words were dramatic, but because they sounded exactly like her. She had always noticed quiet acts of kindness. She had always appreciated people who did their jobs without demanding recognition. The note felt less like a message and more like a clue she had intentionally left behind. Meanwhile, life around me continued as though nothing had changed. Family members called to discuss estate matters. Distant relatives shared memories. Several people mentioned how fortunate Linda was to have been rewarded for her years of devotion. Each time I heard those comments, I remained polite. I did not argue. I did not reveal what I had learned. The records were still incomplete, and I wanted facts before emotions entered the conversation. One afternoon, Rachel contacted me again. She explained that while reviewing archived files, she had discovered additional documentation from the final 18 months of Grandma's life. Some of the records included scheduling summaries, caregiver assignments, transportation logs, and notes from administrative staff. The agency maintained everything for legal and medical purposes. Rachel asked if I wanted to see them. The following morning, I returned to the office. This time the folder waiting for me was even thicker than before. I settled into the same conference room and began reading. Hour after hour passed. The picture became clearer with every page. Caregivers had visited nearly every day, sometimes twice a day. They handled grocery shopping, medication reminders, meal preparation, transportation, and companionship. Their names appeared constantly throughout the records. Linda's appeared only occasionally. Then I found something unexpected. Several transportation logs documented rides to medical appointments. Each entry listed who accompanied Grandma. I assumed at least some would show Linda's name. Instead, most listed professional caregivers. A few listed me. One listed a cousin. None listed Linda during an entire 6-month period. I turned another page. Then another. The pattern remained the same. By late afternoon, I felt emotionally exhausted. Not because the truth was shocking anymore, but because it was becoming undeniable. Before leaving, I asked Rachel a question. Did anyone at the agency ever believe Linda was providing most of the care? Rachel exchanged a glance with one of the administrative supervisors who happened to be nearby. The supervisor gave a small, sad smile. Honestly, no, she said. We knew who was here. We tracked everything. Her answer lingered in my mind during the drive home. We knew who was here. Such a simple sentence. Such a powerful one. That evening, I opened my laptop and began reviewing public social media posts from previous years. I was not looking for scandal. I was looking for timelines, dates, locations, activities. The results surprised even me. On multiple occasions when Linda later claimed she had spent entire weeks caring for Grandma, photographs placed her somewhere else entirely. Weekend trips, resort visits, group outings, celebrations. There was nothing wrong with any of those activities. People deserve vacations and personal lives. The problem was the story she had built around them afterward. A story that seemed increasingly disconnected from reality. Just before midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from a cousin. The message was brief. A family meeting had been scheduled for the following week to discuss remaining estate matters. Linda would be there. So would several relatives who still believed every word she said. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I looked at the growing stack of records on my dining room table. For the first time since the funeral, I had the feeling that events were moving towards something unavoidable. And deep down, I suspected that meeting would change everything. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at the office of David Collins, the attorney handling the estate. During the days leading up to it, I did something that surprised even me. I stopped investigating. Not because I had lost interest, but because I had already seen enough to understand what was happening. The records were no longer a collection of isolated details. Together, they formed a complete picture. What remained was not discovery. It was timing. Every evening, I sat at my dining room table with a cup of tea and reviewed the documents one last time. Visitor logs, transportation records, caregiver schedules, administrative summaries, even the handwritten note from Grandma. The facts were quiet, but they were consistent. And consistency has a way of becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Linda seemed more confident than ever. Family group messages became filled with conversations about Grandma's generosity and her desire to reward devotion. Relatives repeated the same assumptions over and over. Linda never corrected them. In fact, she seemed to encourage them without directly saying much herself. A carefully timed comment here. A nostalgic story there. Every conversation reinforced the image she had spent years creating. One afternoon, a cousin called me. He spoke warmly about Linda and the sacrifices she had supposedly made. I listened politely. Then he said something that stayed with me. Honestly, Emily, I do not know how she found the strength. Being there every day must have been exhausting. I looked down at the stack of records on my table and felt an odd mixture of sadness and disbelief. Not anger, sadness, because so many good people had accepted a story simply because it had been repeated often enough. After we ended the call, I walked into the backyard and sat beneath the old maple tree Grandma had helped plant decades earlier. The afternoon air was cool. A gentle breeze moved through the branches overhead. For a moment, I thought about calling Linda. Part of me wanted to ask a simple question. Why? Why build a version of events that could not survive scrutiny? But another part of me already knew the answer would not matter. The truth was sitting in a folder on my dining room table. It did not need an argument. It only needed to be seen. 2 days before the meeting, Rachel called again. Her voice sounded hesitant. I wanted to let you know something, she said. The agency director has agreed to attend if necessary. I sat upright in my chair. You mean in person? Yes, she replied. If questions come up regarding documentation, she is willing to explain how the records were maintained. I thanked her and ended the call. For the first time, I realized the situation had moved beyond private conversations. Independent people were now willing to stand behind the records publicly. That mattered. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived 20 minutes early. The conference room was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the blinds and stretched across the polished table. I placed my folder in front of me and waited. One by one, relatives began arriving. Then Linda entered. She smiled warmly and greeted everyone with the calm confidence of someone who believed the story had already been decided. For a moment, our eyes met across the room. She looked completely at ease. I simply nodded and returned my attention to the folder resting on the table. Because in a matter of minutes, the conversation would begin. And for the first time since Grandma's funeral, every claim would finally have to stand beside the evidence. David Collins opened the meeting with the calm professionalism that had made him a trusted attorney for decades. He thanked everyone for coming and reviewed several routine estate matters before turning to the subject that had clearly drawn the most attention: Grandma's remaining financial assets. Around the conference table, relatives sat quietly. Some looked tired. Others looked curious. Linda appeared composed. She folded her hands neatly in front of her and listened with a small, confident smile. As the discussion progressed, several family members began sharing memories. Stories about holidays. Stories about birthdays. Stories about Grandma's generosity. Then someone mentioned Linda's dedication during Grandma's final years. The room immediately filled with agreement. One cousin described Linda as selfless. Another praised her commitment. A family friend remarked that very few people would have given so much of themselves to care for an elderly relative. Through it all, Linda remained modest. She never directly praised herself. She did not need to. Everyone else was doing it for her. I sat quietly and listened. Months earlier, I might have joined the conversation. I might have repeated the same assumptions. But now every compliment landed differently. Not because I wanted to embarrass my sister. Not because I wanted revenge. The records had changed something inside me. They had replaced assumptions with facts. Eventually, David asked whether anyone wished to add anything before the meeting moved forward. Linda glanced around the table. Then she spoke. Her voice was gentle and measured. She talked about Grandma's declining health. She described difficult days and sleepless nights. She spoke about responsibility, sacrifice, and family duty. Several people nodded sympathetically. One relative even wiped away a tear. I watched carefully as Linda continued. The details sounded convincing because they were built around emotions everyone understood: love, obligation, loyalty. Yet I noticed something important. Whenever she discussed specific events, the details remained vague. General descriptions, broad statements, no dates, no timelines, no records, just impressions. When she finished speaking, silence settled over the room. David thanked her and prepared to continue. That was the moment I finally spoke. Before we move on, I said calmly, there is something I think everyone should see. Several heads turned toward me. Linda's expression remained unchanged, although I noticed a brief flicker of surprise in her eyes. I opened the folder I had brought with me and removed several documents. Nobody spoke. Even the room itself seemed quieter. I did not hand the papers out immediately. Instead, I looked around the table and chose my words carefully. Over the past few weeks, I have spent time reviewing records related to Grandma's care. Professional records. Linda shifted slightly in her chair. It was a small movement, but I noticed it. Those records document who was present. I continued. They document appointments, visits, transportation, caregiving schedules, and daily support. Across the table, one cousin frowned with confusion. Another leaned forward. David remained silent, allowing me to continue. Linda finally spoke. Emily, what exactly are you trying to say? Her tone remained polite, but there was a new tension beneath it. I met her gaze. I am saying that before anyone reaches conclusions about what happened during Grandma's final years, we should look at the documentation. For the first time that morning, the confidence around the table began to shift. Questions replaced assumptions. Curiosity replaced certainty. And as I placed the first set of records in front of David Collins, I realized the story everyone believed was about to face something it had never faced before. Verification. The room remained silent as David Collins began reviewing the documents. He moved slowly, reading each page with the same careful attention he gave every legal matter. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody checked a phone. Even the relatives who had arrived expecting a routine meeting now seemed focused on the records spread across the conference table. After several minutes, David adjusted his glasses and looked toward me. These appear to be official caregiving records, he said. Do you have additional documentation? I nodded and slid another folder across the table. Inside were transportation logs, visitor records, and scheduling summaries covering more than a year of Grandma's life. David opened the folder and continued reading. Across from me, Linda sat perfectly still. Her expression remained calm, but she no longer looked comfortable. One by one, family members began examining copies of the documents. A cousin studied a visitor log. An aunt reviewed appointment records. Questions started quietly. Then they became more direct. This says professional caregivers visited almost every day. These transportation records show someone else accompanied her. Why are there so few family visits listed? Nobody was accusing anyone. They were simply reading. That was what made the moment so powerful. The records spoke for themselves. David eventually looked up again. There is another matter everyone should understand, he said. These documents were maintained as part of a professional caregiving program. Accuracy would have been required. Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. The assumptions that had filled the room earlier were beginning to unravel. Then the conference room door opened. Rachel entered alongside the agency director. I had not told anyone they would be attending. A few relatives appeared surprised. Rachel greeted everyone politely before taking a seat near the end of the table. The agency director introduced herself and explained her role. David then asked several straightforward questions regarding how records were maintained. The director answered each one clearly. Every visit documented. Every appointment recorded. Every schedule verified. No drama. No emotion. Just procedure. As the explanation continued, I noticed something changing around the table. People were no longer looking at Linda with admiration. They were looking at the documents. Facts had replaced stories. Eventually, David turned toward Rachel. During your time caring for Margaret Carter, would you describe Linda as the primary caregiver? The room became completely still. Rachel chose her words carefully. No, she replied. Linda visited occasionally, but the majority of daily care was provided by our staff. Nobody reacted immediately. The answer simply settled over the room. Then another relative asked to see additional logs. Someone else requested appointment summaries. Page after page passed from hand to hand. Every document reinforced the same reality. Linda had not been absent entirely, but neither had she been the constant presence many people had believed. Finally, one cousin looked directly at Linda. Why did we all think you were there every day? Linda opened her mouth, then paused. For several seconds, she seemed unable to find the right response. The confidence that had surrounded her since the funeral was gone. In its place was uncertainty. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. They simply waited. But the silence felt different now. Earlier, it had protected assumptions. Now it demanded honesty. I sat quietly and watched the room absorb the truth. Not because I felt victorious. I did not. In fact, I felt surprisingly sad. Grandma had spent her entire life valuing family above everything else. She would have hated seeing people divided. Yet she also valued honesty. And as I looked around the table, I realized something important. The truth was no longer hidden inside folders and records. It was sitting in plain sight for everyone to see. And there was still one document left that nobody had read. The final document rested near the bottom of the folder. Compared to the caregiving records, transportation logs, and visitor summaries, it looked almost insignificant. A single page, a few lines written in Grandma's familiar handwriting. Yet as David Collins lifted it from the stack, I felt something shift inside me. Throughout the meeting, facts had corrected assumptions. This document was different. This was Grandma's own voice. David read it slowly. The room remained silent. The note expressed gratitude to the professional caregivers who had supported her during difficult years. It thanked friends and relatives who visited when they could. Then came the sentence that seemed to stop everyone from breathing for a moment. Grandma wrote that true kindness was often quiet, and that the people who helped the most were not always the ones who received the most attention. Nobody spoke after David finished reading. The words hung in the room like a final piece of a puzzle. They did not accuse anyone. They did not criticize anyone. They simply reflected the values Grandma had lived by her entire life. I looked around the conference table. Relatives who had arrived with certainty now looked thoughtful. Some appeared embarrassed by how quickly they had accepted a single version of events. Others seemed saddened by how easily assumptions had replaced reality. Across from me, Linda stared at the tabletop. For the first time since the funeral, she had nothing to add. No story, no explanation, no carefully chosen memory. The documents had not attacked her. They had simply revealed a fuller picture. David carefully placed the note back into the folder. Then he spoke. I think what these records demonstrate is that many people contributed to Margaret's care and well-being. The documentation does not support the idea that responsibility rested primarily on one individual. His words were measured and professional, but their meaning was clear. The narrative everyone had embraced could no longer stand on its own. A cousin who had strongly defended Linda earlier finally broke the silence. I wish we had known all of this sooner, he said quietly. Several people nodded. Rachel sat calmly at the end of the table. She did not look satisfied. She looked relieved. The same was true for the agency director. Neither had come to win an argument. They had come to protect the truth. As the meeting gradually shifted back to estate matters, the atmosphere felt different. Lighter somehow. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because uncertainty had been replaced by understanding. When the meeting finally ended, relatives gathered their papers and prepared to leave. Conversations were quieter than before, more thoughtful. Several people stopped to thank Rachel. Others asked questions about Grandma's final years. The focus had moved away from praise and toward appreciation. Appreciation for everyone who had genuinely helped. I remained seated for a moment after most people had left. Sunlight still stretched across the conference table. The folders remained neatly stacked in front of me. I thought about Grandma. Not her money. Not her estate. Not the disagreements that followed her passing. I thought about her kindness. Her patience. Her refusal to embarrass people even when she could have. In the end, the most valuable thing she left behind was not financial. It was a lesson. Stories can shape what people believe. Repetition can make assumptions feel true. But sooner or later, reality leaves a trail. Records, actions, evidence, small details that quietly wait for someone to notice them. As I walked toward the exit, I glanced once more at the handwritten note. Then I smiled. Grandma had been right. The people who help the most are not always the loudest. And eventually, the truth finds its way into the light.